And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Rob Stevenson, who's familiar to most of us here in the biology department. It was actually Rob who brought David's book to my attention, and so kind of got the ball rolling on this. So I asked him to moderate the panel discussion, which is going to happen now, with at least two of our speakers. So please, hopefully people have questions that they want to ask, comments that they'd like to make. This should be audience involvement. And in fact, if you want to come up even closer, that would be great. We'll be here on the chairs and probably won't have this amplification, so I don't know, it might be a little bit harder to hear for people in the back. But come on up, David and Janet and Rob.
I'll just say a few things that why I'm excited to be here and why I'm excited that you folks are here today. I found David's book on the internet, and I'm a type of person who likes to read and see what's going on, and so interestingly enough, he had a little trouble publishing it. So he ended up going with an academic press and putting it online for free in a PDF. So all of you can get this book, and I think what's powerful about it, what was very powerful about it for me at least, was the idea that he makes explicit the internal conversation you have with yourself all the time. All the time you're sort of thinking about climate change because you're hearing about it. All the scientists here are hearing about climate change all the time. And you're thinking, yeah, the water's going up. Yeah, the ice is melting. Yeah, we can change the energy grid. But, and that's what I do. I do that all the time. But at the same time, I sort of wasn't thinking about the broken present. I was thinking about my friends who are retiring. And I was thinking about this dream that I had about how my life would go. And my life was going to go the way their life has gone. And the way the people before me have retired, and they travel, and they have some good food, and that's about it. They come back here, and life is okay. But in fact, I think David's book convinced me that really that's not the way to be thinking of it anymore. It really touches you in a personal way. I must say that Janet's talk was terrific, very surprising on the one hand, because I always think it's so hard to work with people. I never wanted to be a psychologist or a sociologist because the experimental design is much more complicated. You have to think much harder about how to do those things, and yet that's where the action is. The action is understanding people, right? The action, it's not about the science anymore at all. It's really about understanding people and what they're thinking and how they're thinking. And so I hope you have some good questions, and I think that's why this particular symposium is important, because the focus really is not about that next issue, whether it's the coral or the thunderstorms or the rising sea level. It's about getting people on board. More and more we're going to be thinking about the social sciences. So I think I'll leave it at that now and say that despite reading these things and being terribly worried, I too am an optimist. And the reason I'm an optimist is from the point of view of an evolutionary biologist. Often people who've had evolutionary biology think about Darwin and think about competition. But the other side of Darwin is about cooperation. And what we're talking about here is cooperation. What we really need to get to is cooperation. And there's tremendous work now being done on cooperation. All of you, I'm sure, have heard about that microbiome, that those organisms that live under your arm and the organisms that live on your elbow and so on. And those are the things that for which you're just substrate, right? But you have to live closely with them. You've co-evolved to live with them closely. And so now we just have to learn more about evolution and specifically about cooperation, because that's the key ultimately to dealing with climate change. All right, so let's open it up. Let's hear from our experts today who've been thinking about the social aspects of climate change. Anybody want to start with some questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is George Bryant with the Revolution Books in Cambridge.
Here you go.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm a revolutionary communist, and I'm concerned with the science of understanding what makes this society tick, historically and to the present. Because within this framework, you have a culture, you have modes of thinking, you have the patriarchal relations. For me, in and of itself, the existence of these patriarchal relations is reason enough for a revolution. But there's a whole realm of suffering and needless destruction of the environment that gives further weight to the need to change the whole foundation of our society. But essentially, Mr. Kerwood said some important things about democracy, but I think the essence of what this country is not democracy, but capitalism. There's a certain class that dominates, and they set the terms. And the question of the environment, think about this just thing that happened recently when we acknowledged that the Arctic Circle was melting, right? The polar ice caps were melting. What was the initial reaction of big powers, including our own president? We need to get in there and make sure our interests prevail in terms of extracting those, what's under the water. This is the mentality. It's not because of greed. I think it's built into the whole foundation. And this is the question I want to put on the table. Greed is a symptom, but the deeper problem is that the compulsion to compete and the compulsion to expand and create wealth because you're competing with other entities around the world that are doing the same.
So I think that's a terrific question.
So yes, there is. It's a big question for a psychologist, but there is the problem with what we call corporate capitalism, and there is the sense of competition and the need to maintain the status quo. And the status quo is what we'd like to do, and these visions of where we'd like to go. And I do think it's fundamentally a problem. And part of that, though, I try to think about, well, what do we do about that? Where do we go with that? And what we need to be doing is having more frank and open discussions about it. I would argue that we have to be thinking about raising our voices to talk about what it is that's problematic and what are the things in our culture that lead us to continue to endorse those things. So Tim Kasser talks a lot about the role, our acceptance of a marketplace ideology in our culture, and how we accept marketing all over the place, and it just becomes normative wherever you are. And so we have installed this viewpoint of this is the way the world is, and this is the way we should be operating. So we have our children with T-shirts on that have companies on it, so they're just walking advertisements. We have going to sporting events. We have company literature all over the place. It's infiltrated wherever we are, and there's this acceptance of the role of the economic system in doing that. So I guess I agree with that. And there is research actually on the focus on money, and when you have people thinking about money, they do work harder for their money, but they tend to become much more self-centered. They tend to be less helpful of other people. So just going into a room and on your computer screen, if you have dollar signs on your computer screen, and then you get the opportunity to help somebody else in a study, you're less likely to help them than if there were flowers on your screen. And so there is this, when you get this focus on money, you tend to end up focusing on the self and not going beyond the self and being more self-transcendent and working with other people. So I think it is fundamentally, it is a problem when we have an economic system that is focused on constantly achieving more power and more status and more money, as opposed to one that is more cooperative and helpful for other people.
Thank you for your question, George. I do think that today, between Steve's emphasis on slavery and Janet's emphasis on gender, and your emphasis on capitalism, we're getting a sense of the interrelatedness of these different things. And arguably, capitalism and the market is the core problem. So one thing I talk about in the book is something I get at this way. Quickly, can you imagine the end of the biosphere? Yes. Can you imagine the end of the market? No. So I would argue that for us, capitalism was more real than nature. next question. Can we imagine the end of the biosphere? Yes. Can we imagine our political system working to find a solution to end climate change? Well, you need 60 votes to get it through the Senate. So let's keep fighting to elect, okay, how many years will that take, etc. You have a whole fight in your head. So I respectfully submit that's what we're going to do in this country, because we're good Americans and we will rely on the legislature to do the big deed, right? So, conclusion, we think of our political system as more real than nature as well. So we doubly deny the reality of nature. So I think the question about capitalism is right on the money, because in order to do, Steve Krogwood was right, in order to get to where we need to go, we need a political revolution in this country. And that means taking on questions like greed. He was very explicit, and I agree with what he said. So actually getting to a different way of understanding the economic relationship to nature will require fundamental reorientation to what we think of as real. So we do have, it's not just a lot of work to do, we have fundamental transformation in the premises of how we think before we will fundamentally get to where we need to go. So that's how I would respond to the question. I think that we do have it's levels of thinking to do that we're not used to doing, all the way down to the premises, and that makes us very uncomfortable.
I have been sort of gradually coming to believe that it's not very much of an exaggeration, slightly an exaggeration, but not very much, to say that modern capitalism and the use of fossil fuels go intimately together. And I don't know whether that means that the end of fossil fuels or the end of the role, the central role of fossil fuels in our society would also mean the end of modern capitalism. That may not be the case, I don't know. But it certainly historically was absolutely the case that without the need to invest in complicated, expensive machinery, you couldn't develop what we now think of as capitalism. There was sort of a capitalism before that. There were markets anyway, but it wasn't nearly developed in the way that we have now. It wasn't predatory.
I'll add one more comment too. There's a this is to pretend I'm Steve Krogwood. One of the interesting things Steve talked about was the westward movement of slavery, and there's an interesting perspective on this in a book called Empire of Cotton, which describes the growth of the cotton industry. And what was so interesting to me about that book is that it describes the way the British Empire got a hold of made the deal with the southern cotton growers. In other words, as the land wore out, they had to move west to be able to grow cotton. And to do that, and he needed money. And they got it from the Brits in return for the cotton that they spun and sold around the world. And that, of all things, invented the futures market. There was no futures market. It was the first futures market. So it's very deeply tied to capitalism and our current system of how we do business. It's still astounding to me to think about what happened with the housing crisis. Right? A lot of people lost a lot of money, but people who made money still had that money. I mean, the people who are accountable they're fine. Another question.
Steve mentioned the idea of a change in the energy system, change in the energy economy might be something that could drive the change in our attitudes towards the planet. And he made a parallel with like IT changing in recent years and how lots of people made money, and so this, sort of moved the whole industry forward. And how do you folks feel about the possibility? It does feel like we're constantly being told and suggested that we need to speak about the environment in terms of its economic importance and all that, how it fits the economy. So it all seems to come back to the economy, which is what you folks are saying. So could a change in the energy system, would that be an economic driver that might actually change the future of the planet? Does that make sense?
Well, thank you for the question. One of the things that interests me about the current conversation amongst economists is how much they emphasize that a carbon tax that was transparent at the point of origin. So you would tax the producer of fossil fuels, you would tax anything that produced carbon at the point of origin, and then it would be paid for downstream by everyone who used that form of energy. But if you had a good carbon tax, and perhaps if you indexed it so it would continue to rise year by year, so it got more and more expensive to use any such source. If you had that, then you basically would make everything that was sustainable cheaper than fossil fuels. And suddenly capitalism could take over, and there would be a million ways, a million sources of producing cheap but sustainable energy. So this is part of the conversation, and it uses the market. Right? This isn't socialism, this is capitalism. So for a lot of people, this is very exciting. So what interests me is the fact that a carbon tax idea has never been taken seriously by the Congress. Why is it that a capitalist, supposedly capitalist solution that uses the free market and would in fact be astonishing in how much capitalism would accomplish, hasn't been really seriously considered in this country? That's just a stunning thing. It says that if we actually intervene a little bit in the market, that's read as socialism, and it's unacceptable that, oh, we're going to become Stalinists if we impose a carbon tax. So it strikes me that Steve's optimism is tied to a correct sense that there will be a huge fight to do anything. I am more pessimistic because I know how long it would take to win that fight. And my metaphor might be the civil rights movement, how many decades it takes actually to get something through our legislatures. And yes, a friend of mine who was an American historian said, we can do radical change as long as we accept the premises of American culture, which are individualist and market-oriented. Once we accept those premises, we can, for example, gay rights happens, feminism happens, liberal feminism, liberal gay rights. These things can take place. So judging by his expertise as a historian, we may be able to see change within the terms of the market if we had something like a carbon tax. But I'm not sure that's going to happen in the next year, for example. It might not be the next 10 years.
I think it's an interesting question because I have mixed response to technological solutions and market-based solutions. And in part, I think they're certainly changing the energy system seems to be a necessity. We have to figure out some other way to get our energy. But I think about it in terms of how do you frame that need and how do you frame the outcome. So we in a capitalist society frame giving money as a good way to do things, and that should be motivating. Yet the underlying problem with that is that when people are concerned about environmental problems for things about themselves and for their own self-gain, they tend to do less about the environment. If you frame things about the environment in terms of the biosphere or the importance of helping other people, then people will be more likely to be doing something. So it is a matter of framing. And the problem that I have is that if you focus in on this is a great money market, we can make lots and lots of money here. What you're doing is justifying the explanation that we should be focusing on money as our goal. And then if you find some other way of earning more money, then you think, well, I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to get money there. I'm going to get money this other way of doing it. So it's really important to think about how to frame the market-based solutions or how to frame the technological revolution. And it's not to frame it in terms of self-interest, but to frame it in terms of global interest and social good, in order to have the impact in the end that you have, or to overcome the points in time when it will cost us money. Or so it's important to not think about it too limited.
Yeah, I think it's very, very, very obvious to many of us who are sitting here on the campus this afternoon, and by the comments, very explicit comments made, that we are really talking about the future of humanity, future of society, future of our planet. But for a vast majority of people, even on this campus, this is a sideshow. There are a bunch of people sitting and having a discussion. So since both of you are from the academia, what do you think we need to do in our daily lives of educating people, in our educational system? Where does the environment fit in the whole higher education system? Is it just, that you expect students to take 1 or 2 courses? I'd like to hear more as to what is going on at your institutions.
At my institution, we are beginning the process of pondering whether we should require all students to take a class in this subject. So, and then I'll elaborate on that in a moment. But another thing to mention is what I decided to do when I wrote this book. As Rob generously mentioned earlier, I stepped aside from my usual scholarly career and decided to write a book for the general public because I didn't see such a book out there. I was waiting for a long time and no one wrote it. So every once in a while I will realize that if I think something really needs to be done, and damn it, somebody should do it, then I should do it. Why should I expect Joe down the street to do it, right? So I guess I'm outlining a 2-part response. I think that we in the academy very often do see what's happening. So we have the ethical responsibility to communicate that with the public, which means writing to those outside of our own fields, speaking to the general public. I think we have an ethical responsibility to do that because other people in other professions, people in other ways of life may not be aware. It's really on us, we've got to do it, which means getting outside of our comfort zone, doing things we were not trained to do, doing things we may not really know how to do very well. God knows whether I actually succeeded in reaching very many people with my book, but at least I gave it a shot. So I think that would be part 1. Part 2 would be to be comparatively militant within the institutions where we teach and begin to demand that this is one of the fundamental definitions of being an educated person today. If you don't know about this and don't have a fairly reasonable understanding of the key concerns, you're just simply not an educated person. So if you know how to write, and you've taken introductory this and introductory that, you should have this as part of your education. Now, what a huge headache. Like, who's going to teach that many students? Who's going to hire those people? How do you teach that class? It's just complete pain to even imagine this. On the other hand, what could be more painful than actually transforming the whole society? That's just art. We just happen to, that's the pain that we have to endure. Other people will have other forms of pain. So I very modestly would suggest that we have to go all out, all hands on deck. We do what we can in relation to the general public, and we do what we can in relation to the institutions where we teach. And I guess a third part of my 2-part answer would be something Rob mentioned to me, which was very perceptive about the emotional dimension of our own work as scientists, humanists, and scholars, and the emotional lives of our students, and how we frankly acknowledge aspects of the question like that when we teach the students we are already teaching.
think it's a fascinating question because I think a lot about this, and I think about it in a couple of ways. One, I'll have to acknowledge Billy Spitzer over here has allowed me to think about this in many different ways. But Billy, I work with Billy over at the New England Aquarium, and we do work on informal science education. And so the ability to reach the public is an important part of this. And I guess I think one of the biggest problems we have is not, except for in the political domain, but in the public domain, our biggest problem is disengagement. Or the problem is not that people are denying climate change, it's that they're disengaged with it. And so what Billy is spearheading is the ability to think about where do scientists meet the public. And they meet them in informal science learning centers like zoos and aquariums. And so what he's been able to work on is figuring out how to get people to even just talk about climate change. So I think that's really one of the core parts, is just to get discussions started and to meet people in the public where the public is. So that's the general public. But then in the role as an academic, we have the privilege of having people required to listen to us. And so in our classrooms, I think it's important to be doing that. At Penn State, we're doing lots of other things to try and get the public involved, in a sense, the student public. So I'm working with somebody who has done what we call climate change conversation groups. He started it actually with race conversation groups, with the idea people didn't want to talk about race. And so he gets students together to have conversations and has one person there just to facilitate it, to make sure they talk about it. And now he's moved to include climate change. So we just bring students in for part of the classroom requirement is to have this, just have the discussion. Not where we're trying to actually teach them anything, not where we're trying to give them messages, but to get it on the agenda so they're just talking about it. And one of the reasons that's important is that what we found both working with Billy and in some of our lab work is that because people are not talking about climate change, they assume other people don't care about climate change. And it's a sense of pluralistic ignorance, but actually most people actually do care to some extent. But if we don't think other people care, then we don't talk. And then we don't talk, and it becomes a spiral of silence. And so reversing that spiral of silence is really important, to start getting people engaged enough just to have conversations about it. So we have these conversations, part of classrooms, some are required component of the classrooms. We also are working with what we call Sustainable Communities Collaborative at Penn State. So we have courses that are working with community-based programs that they want to do. So my class is working with trying to increase the State College area to sign up for renewable energy suppliers for their energy in their homes. And so the borough wants them to do it. They want to increase the green characterizations of the borough. And we're interested in it as psychologists to how you do that, so my class is doing that. But we have students working with the borough doing projects. We've got about 40 different projects. It's just in the borough, it's this collaboration. And the reason we're able to do that is Penn State is invested in a Sustainability Institute. So we had a whole bunch of different groups all over campus doing things, and they brought them all together. And so we have a director of the institution. We now have a president who actually believes in climate change and thinks it's important. And so having the leadership there, having them invest in an institution where this is the job of the people to do this, figuring out how to integrate that within the academic domain, and getting conversations going, just having people start talking about it, and then having them interested enough to explore it within whatever domain they're in. Because that's what I generally find, is that people who are interested enough will try and figure out, within this area that I'm interested in, what am I going to do? So we're going to do it in literature, we're going to do it in psychology, I'll do it in sciences. You could talk about climate change in just about any domain, so I think it's important to get that conversation going.
I've noticed a gender bias in people asking questions. Is there any, or an age bias too? Is there anybody here who'd like to represent some of those other groups? Students? All right.
guys. My name's Thomas. I'm a junior at UMass Boston, environmental science major. So I don't exactly have a question, but would you guys like to discuss upon how it's not exactly irrelevant, but for us, for climate change, like we're not going to wake up tomorrow and the world's going to change at all. But so I think what we need to do is try to get the point across that our kids and our kids' kids, those are the people that are going to have problems with climate change. And like you referenced, if we go on a trip for like a few years and come back, if we live right on the coast, our houses could be in danger of being collapsed or whatnot. So I was wondering if you guys would be able to discuss on that a little bit more, and like the social aspects of maybe why we don't think about like our future generations as much as we really should.
Well, that's actually interesting because there's a whole theory called construal theory. It's about how do people construe the world, and you can construe the world in terms of, by default, people tend to think about the present. So what do I doing now? What do I have to do when I get up? What do I have to do for my classes? But to think about climate change and environmental problems is more abstract and it's more future oriented. And so part of the goal is to get people to think beyond the current time. And so actually there is, if you have people contemplate their legacy, just say, what would you like your legacy to be? And when people do that, they're more likely to be engaged in environmental problems, more likely to donate their time and effort to environmental problems. So I think you're right in a sense of the importance of thinking about the future is a really important domain. The stumbling block sometimes happens is when you start to try and actually do something, though, it becomes present. And so the present tends to be, well, how do we do that? How do I overcome all the things that are around me right now while still maintaining that future perspective? I just thought of something else with what I was going to say with that. So one of the issues is also when people think about things, they do have an optimism bias. And so when people think about where are the environmental problems, they think it's going to happen somewhere else. It's not going to happen here. It's going to happen in the future. It's not going to happen now. So actually there's a study that looked at people's perceptions of climate change and where's it going to happen. And 17 of the 18 countries said it was going to happen in other countries. It's not going to happen in my country. So there's this optimist bias about it. And so there is this temptation then, because of that, to now let's turn it around and let's talk about what is going to happen now and what's happening around you, what's going to happen in your neighborhood. And then that doesn't always work. So there are a couple of things that predict when that's not going to work. Some of that, it doesn't work if you don't have any place attachment, we call. So if you talk about an area where people don't feel connected to that place, telling them what's going to happen in that place doesn't matter to them. And the other part is when the problems become so big, people say, well, what can I do about it? And they start having a sense of helplessness. And so we have a temptation to keep talking about how big and awful this is. And the more you say how big and awful it is, the more people feel less powerful and less able to do anything. So it's important to, whenever to talk about things, is to also make sure you talk about things with a possible solution. Those messages are what we call fear appeals. And fear appeals backfire unless you give people a way to think efficaciously about what they can do. And it has to be a credible enough way that it actually they can see it matters. And so one of the things we've been working on is trying to think about how you get people to think about working as a group as opposed to working by yourself. And so one of the things that we're doing with this community collaborative I talked about is that some of our pilot materials, if you talk about climate change, what can you do? And you could do this. Or another version we say, what can we do? And people just changing the word from you can make a difference to we can make a difference actually makes people feel like they're more efficacious. So it's really important to be talking about the problems and making them salient, but it's also important to pair those things with activities that now people think they can make a difference. Otherwise they think, well, why bother? What's the point? Why should I be talking about it? I can't do anything about it. I've got other things in my life. So it's important to be pairing those things with things people can do. And one of the things we talk about, and back to the New England Aquarium work, is that talking about it is one of those things you can do. And so that's something that is an important behavior outcome.
I guess there's such wonderful answers Janet gives us about all kinds of things. I'll come right back to part of your question about what's happening about climate change, and I would again just emphasize that it's already present. It feels pretty present if you were part of the world that was hit by Hurricane Sandy in New York City or New Jersey. It feels pretty present if you endured the 4-year drought in California. I guess it was broken to some extent by El Nino this last winter. It feels pretty present if throughout the Mountain West you're enduring a drought that may simply go on because we're learning that that's the new normal there. It feels pretty present if you live in the Mississippi River Valley and are experiencing 100-year floods every 5 years. It feels pretty present if entire ecosystems are changing throughout the Southeast. And if you have Zika virus coming and dengue fever coming and other tropical kinds of phenomena emerging in the North American continent because of climate change. It feels very present in Maine because the Gulf of Maine has warmed 5 degrees in roughly a decade, so that the lobster population of Maine is going to be migrating north. And within a decade, I'm not sure, I haven't seen numbers on this, but my hunch is that fairly soon the lobster fisheries of Maine will be found in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Can you imagine? No Maine lobster? What does that mean? So climate change, even apart from rising oceans, let's say you just forget about the rising oceans, completely forget about it. You still have trees, millions of trees dying throughout the boreal forests to the northwest and the southwest, other parts of the country. You have maple sap season radically deranged from its normal part of the year and migrating north again. So climate change is very real for almost everyone on the continent if you stop and think about it. It's not about our kids and our grandkids. And in fact, there's a chapter in my book where I suggest that it's wiser and more loving of us not to bear children. It's not an act of love to bring someone onto a planet when just the economic base for their future is already in doubt. And there are going to be 9 billion of us on this planet by the year 2030. We don't need more people. So I think it's a huge reality for us in the present. It's great if we want to think of its framing. It's a framing difference, I think, and Janet might be able to teach us the best way to frame it to motivate our action. But clearly, journalism is good. Good journalism, at least, has been making clear that climate change is here.
We have someone else?
I just wanted to add something there. I think it's very interesting that here in Boston, Boston is one of the most vulnerable large cities in the United States, certainly on the East Coast, to even small amounts of sea level rise. And Boston's municipality is actually doing quite a bit about that, but it's not publicized. I don't know why that is, but have you seen, when you're in environmental studies, have you seen those maps that the Boston Harbor Association has put out? And it's really pretty unbelievable. But people in Boston don't know that. They don't realize that. And I think that's one of the things that I sort of wanted to get at with this symposium, or that we wanted to get, is that, somehow there's a disconnect between even the amounts of modeling and research that are being done and people's awareness. People are living in Dorchester in places that are going to be, several inches to several feet underwater within a short amount of time, not their grandchildren.
We have time for one more question?
Okay.
So my question was, in to either both of you. How can we effectively communicate with the general public to positively inspire action? Since we mentioned that a lot of environmental campaigns fail in making a personal touch with the public or making the public feel and touch our personal level, and at the same time we shouldn't frame environmental problems in the self. We should frame it, and as you mentioned, some key points, and make it more collective action. So how can we talk to the general public about the science and make it in a positive way?
Okay. So this is just, again, this is what Billy is working on. And I've got the privilege, it's one of the best things I've done is to work with the New England Aquarium on these, how do we talk about climate change with people? And so one of the things that we emphasize is understanding the science is important. So when we talk about the research, we work with a group called Frameworks Institute in California. They did some baseline work about what do people know about climate change. Well, they still think it's about the ozone and ozone holes. They don't know the difference between carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. They don't understand how sea level can be rising. They don't understand storm surges. So one of the things that needs to be done when talking about climate change is to talk about climate systems and talk about the process by which fossil fuels end up leading to a warmer planet and why that's a problem. And so making those scientific connections. So talking about the science in a way that is about the process of science, not just the impacts of climate change are critical. The other part about connections, so connecting to people. Some of my earliest work when I did as a graduate school student was trying to get people to eat better and exercise. So what we learned from all those sorts of things that we've done are two things. One is that you have to go to people. They're not going to come to you. So you have to find out where people are located and have your conversations with those people where they're at. And the other part that we've learned is that it's a lot about social networks. It's about talking to the key influential people, talking to people who are centers of social networks, talking to people that we call bridges. And those are people who are part of more than one group, so they can bridge information from one group to another group. So picking who you're going to talk to, when people change behaviors, they mostly change them when you're talking to other people. So you have to go to people, and when you go to them, you need to have them, again, make those connections to other people. It's the social process that really matters. When we're in a current system, when marketing's everywhere, we get BuzzFeeds here, we got things on our Facebook pages popping up over here. We've got so many things targeting us for our attention. What we really pay attention to are people that we know and what they say. So it's thinking about this in terms of relationships and where people are at and what groups they belong to have those conversations and have them in a way that can effectively communicate what climate science is about and what they can do about it. What can they do as a group? What can they do as a community to work together?
Thank you.